I thought that perhaps it would be desirable if we gave some instruction today in preserving the mind according to divine decree. Obviously, the mind is a derivative of the mind of God. Most of us from day to day do not think of our mind as being derived from the mind of God because we feel so involved with our mind that the possessive sense occupies us almost completely, and we say, this is my mind. I will make up my mind. I will think about it. In actuality, our mind is wholly derived from God, as is our body, and all that we have. We have nothing that we now claim to possess that we did not first receive from God. Man's failure to acknowledge this has a tendency, latent though it may be, to cut him off from the nourishment that his soul requires. The Scriptures support this. The souls that forget God are always cast down. Now, it does not make any difference whether people believe in God or whether they don't believe in God. The law functions either way. We may say, I don't believe in the law of gravity, but if we jump off a building, we will be pulled down nevertheless. So the mind that we have is derived from God's mind. However, the use of that mind is our own. Let us make that distinction. And the use or misuse that we have made of our mind has framed its tendencies. Now, coming to the feet of the ascended masters and the ascended master consciousness, as we approach their feet, we have a tendency to relate more to the mind of God than we do when we approach it from our own human standpoint. In other words, we humanly, finitely seek to understand the infinite. Understanding the infinite with a finite mind. This is like trying to cram the Atlantic Ocean into a teacup. And that isn't even a good illustration of it. But we do it. Now, I am convinced that our use of the mind is all important, and that the use cannot be framed within any one moment, but is being framed within every moment, and we are responsible for every moment. This is why I'm always so amused how people will go somewhere and hide when they're doing something they think God should not know about. They'll go off into a corner, they'll pull down the curtains, they seek to conceal from the prying eyes of humanity whatever a form of nefarious deed they're going to do, because they feel that if it is not known by man, that it is not known by God. And this is ridiculous on the face of it, because if no one knew it other than themselves, the fact that their mind is so directly related to the mind of God immediately appoints the recording stylus of their being to make the etching on their Akashic records. The Akashic records then are the records of everything that has ever taken place, either in our individual life or in the life of others. The Akashic records do not stand as a condemnation of man. The Akashic records stand as supporting the justice of God, because as thou sowest, so shall thou reap, is the fiat of the Akashic records. Whatever you sow, that you're going to reap. This law assures us that as we remember Him, remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth, as we remember Him, the more we are drawing to ourselves the goodness, the dominion, the power, the glory, and every aspect of the divinity. our recording of these divine aspects in the personal Akashic records is what actually has a tendency to make the difference between peoples. We all know when we err. And I do not stand up here to condemn you and say, well, I've never erred. We have all sinned, St. Paul says, and come short of the glory of God. But inasmuch as this is a shortness rather than a ponderous division between us, it's not a huge wall, it's a shortness. We've run in a race and we were short of the mark. That doesn't mean that we're such bad runners. The difference between the man who won the race and those who came in second or third or fourth may only be a matter of a few hundred yards, or a yard or two. It can only be a foot in a photo finish. So we should recognize this and understand that God is not and has not framed an idea in his mind of condemning us. He's not interested in condemnation. Condemnation comes from three sources. It comes from our fellow men, who are always prone to condemn us for the same things they do themselves, and probably worse. It comes from the dark powers of the world, who see in condemnation a weapon whereby they can demean the person so that he says to himself, well, I've done this, now I might as well do that. I've made so many mistakes, I might as well go and do more. Does this make sense? You've charged $500 worth of Schenley's 5 crown at the liquor store, so you haven't been able to pay it for 4 months, and they're after you, so now you go and charge some more. Doesn't make any sense. If you can't pay the first bill, how are you going to pay the second? But you see, there is no logic that applies to the satanic forces that is just. They have no just logic. They have a double standard. They have one standard to turn the edge of your mind away from God. And they have another standard to sell you a bill of goods. So the third person now that is engaged in the business of condemnation is yourself. You are error-prone. Humanity is error-prone, and they're also condemnation-prone. Now, I think it's very dangerous for people to be so insensitive in conscience that they cannot even recognize their own mistakes. But at the same time, I do not see, other than continual repetition of something you're able to cope with, I do not see any damage in this at all. I feel that we should not condemn ourselves. But, by a like token, we should not excuse ourselves. I hope you're getting the point I'm trying to put across here. But not excusing yourself or raising a higher standard for yourself tomorrow than what you had today, this is perfectly valid. It's not condemnation to raise a higher standard. I think you can see that. And the razor's edge with which we deal here is one where our relationship with the divine becomes a relationship that is a case of the Son learning to master the Father's business, rather than be mastered by the monkey business that he has engaged in through the centuries, which humanity en masse has actually acceded to. They've agreed to it. They consider it a standard of performance. Today it is still quite popular to cheat, to outsmart your fellow men, to be a little wiser in business than they are. And this is considered acceptable in the best of circles. People think it's all right as long as they win. This is ridiculous. The motive is always what we must look at. But we must also be careful with the acts itself. For the motive may be pure, but if we perceive that the act that we are doing is not in keeping with the motive, then we must also improve the manifestation of the act, whatever act it is. We must consider the impact of actions upon others. And I believe that is also important. Now, I do not say that the standard of perfection is something that we achieve as one enters the games or a contest. I do not say that. I think it is a natural outpicturing or outgrowth of the divine consciousness. But so many people, as I pointed out in the beginning, do not feel that they have a divine consciousness, and this is utterly ridiculous. Of course you have a divine consciousness. It probably is latent, dormant, or in a relative sense it is not fully awakened, and I would prefer the latter. Because many people are very kind, but now we begin to wonder about this great divine consciousness. We say to ourselves, well, I have it, so what? So what? It's the sun of your being, this divine consciousness. This is what rays out illumination to your mind. But like the clouds in the sky opaque the sun, like the rain that falls comes down and conceals from us all that is behind the clouds, so our consciousness from time to time is interfered with by opaquing ideas. But that doesn't kill the sun. It doesn't put out its light. It simply conceals it from our view, our vision. The particular facet of the mind that we have cannot perceive through the opaquing substance. Now, from time to time, our mind then lacks the stability of the mind of God. It is not so. The mind does not lack the stability. The mind has all the stability of God. It is the nature of God. It is the mind of God. What is it then that's happening? It is the introduction always of these opaquing substance and ideas, the variances created by habits that we have created. Sometimes we even come face to face with an illusion that we are not sane. Did you know that the dark forces will tell you that sometimes? They'll tell you that you're not sane. And the reason for this is that you're trying to cram infinity into the finite. This is impossible. In order for you to understand the infinite, you have to expand the mind into infinite dimensions, and then functioning from the level of infinite dimensions, grasp infinity. You cannot do it. It's awe-inspiring when you start trying to look at it from a human level. But after all, a college student knows so many things more than a little kindergartner, doesn't he? And I suspect that if the little kindergartner tried to cram himself with trigonometry and all kinds of higher forms of thought, the little child would be quite overawed and perhaps could not grasp it. I don't think he could in most cases. So we must learn to pace ourselves. In other words, we must not expect so much of ourselves that our condemnation causes us itself to fall short of the mark. We must ask and call for that state of cosmic balance that enables us to recognize that wherever we are is not where we're going to be. Oh yes, we can slide down the mountain as well as climb up. But if we are really trying, it is highly doubtful, judging by the experiences of the great masters and those who have been on the path much longer than any of us, it is highly doubtful if we're going to crash all the way down to the bottom. And if we did, at least in thought, if our thought hit the bottom, I mean, it would have to bounce back up to whatever level it actually has been functioning at. Because you have a functional level of manifestation. You vibrate at a golden mean of what you are. Do you understand me? I mean, there's a point where you vibrate. And if you fall below it, you don't actually pull your golden mean down. You're only taking the averages now. Do you follow me? You're taking the averages of what you're vibrating at from time to time. This is where you really are in attainment. And the reach always should exceed the grasp. Therefore, you're trying to put a goal way ahead of yourself. And I think a lot of condemnation by people is because they set the goal so far ahead of what they are, that they feel by comparison that they are guilty of something or other. Now, I'm sure that we're all guilty of failures to apprehend opportunities, and this is probably one of our greatest weaknesses, the greatest weaknesses of humanity. Failure to apprehend opportunity. Right now, everyone here is being tutored outwardly and inwardly. We have our inward tutor of our Holy Christ Self, our God Presence, the Ascended Masters. We have the outer expression of the dictations and the messengers' conversations and the Holy Scriptures and the various writings. And we have our music. and all of these things. So we have many functional spiritual guideposts along the way. And these are almost elastic, like a rubber band. They have a resiliency to them. They seem to go with us when we drop. They're there to help us. We don't lose our tie to God because we happen to slip in one respect. If we did, God pity us, because it would look then as though He were playing a game with us, and He was sitting up here and saying, well, they didn't do it, so now we'll put them in a cage somewhere and leave them locked up for the next 10,000 years. It's not so. The greatest condemnation of all and the greatest failures come when people accept the satanic delusions that there is no hope for them, or when they accept the judgment of their peers even, that there is no hope for them, or when they accept even the judgment of themselves, that there's no hope for them, for these things are not valid in the light of cosmic creation. Now, I'm referring to a person who's trying. I'm talking about somebody that's trying. I'm not talking about somebody who doesn't really care. Someone who doesn't attend services, who doesn't read the pearls, who doesn't read the keeper's lessons, who's not interested in God, who wants to have nothing but fun, who wants to have everyone look up to them for achievement when they are not willing to even invest. This is something else again. I'm talking about the devotee. If you're a devotee, if you really love God, if you really love the Masters, if you really love the divine plan, if you really love helping your fellow man, if you want to do something right, and you're really trying, I believe God takes notice whether or not tangible manifestations appear. They may not always appear exactly when you think they should. But remember this, the seed that sprouts is below the surface of the consciousness. And therefore, many times, you are much further ahead spiritually than you are aware of. Of course, this can be taken reversed. You can be behind spiritually in a much greater degree than you're aware of. We often find people come in and they say, well, I've really attained. Now, before I ever came to Summit Lighthouse, I was a member of this or that, and I attained. Well, a lot of times we find that the attainment has a negative impressionism, and I'm not talking about any person present here. I have no person in mind at all. But I'm just speaking in general ways that people can think they've got an awful lot when they have very little. And this becomes a form of spiritual pride and conceit where it is so displayed, or where it so controls the person. So what we're interested in now is in your acknowledgement of the opportunity that you have, and your refusal absolutely to be downed, and your refusal absolutely to allow your mind to function in the various niches which human beings get into, and we all are subject to it. Now, for example, St. Paul said, when I was a child, I thought as a child, and I spake as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. Would to God that this were always so for each of us. It was so for Paul. He, of course, had put away childish things. Now, I think that the problems of humanity are very, very simple in the sense that we can classify them into just a certain number of traps. Probably the biggest trap of all is the ego. I think the ego is a big trap because the ego is that one that says to himself when he's in the crib, he said, I've got to get some attention. Mama, see me. Here I am. And he rattles the side of the crib, or he opens his mouth wide until you can see his tonsils and balls. That is followed through in the 70 and 80-year-old man or woman. Many people never overcome this display of the ego. They want attention, and the motivating power behind everything they do is the creation of attention. As soon as their attention is satiated, at least temporarily, they become relatively happy. Because it's a matter of crying want. And as soon as that is supplied by people looking at them, they're satisfied. This we must end. So the ego is the biggest problem we have. But the ego has many forms of causing us to become victims of its desires. I suspect that all of the opiates, including liquor, everything that affects the mind of man are his desire to escape from introspection. He doesn't like what he sees in himself, and he wants to escape from it. So memory is blunted temporarily by liquor, by pot, by LSD, by any form of opiate derivative, which may promise him that he will raise his consciousness or be able to see into the astral world. Delirium tremens, which used to make men run out of their hospital beds and jump out the window when they'd see these hideous creatures crawling across the floor, up the walls. This was caused by liquor. The DTs, they call it. It was the opening up the psychic centers so they could see all into the astral. And as you know, the astral has many levels, both up and down. So we have to understand that this is also a problem, what I'm talking about now. It is a problem, the desire to escape, escapism. To escape from this ego that we pamper so much, we turn around and go to these other things. And we even delude ourselves into saying, well, this will help to open my consciousness and expand it. There's two things now. Then we have the another corollary to the ego is sex, and sex is not just sex pleasure, it is sex dominion. I hope you realize that. In other words, people want to conquer the opposite sex or be conquered by them because this satisfies the puerile, infantile need for recognition. Some person has recognized them enough to give themselves physically to them. And that is a satisfaction. So it's not only the gratification of temporary titillation of the senses, but it's also the conquering of another person. And this is one of the reasons for great promiscuity, where people not only conquer one woman or one man, but they go out in general and probably conquer a dozen or more. It's because the ego is monstrous, and the ego is not satisfied with the recognition it is achieving, if you can call it achieving. So we have to understand now, we have brought out the ego, we've showed how drugs are used to cloud the ego and various devices whereby we can blunt our perspective so that we don't actually see what's going on. We like this anonymity. In other words, of not knowing who we really are, what we're really doing. Somehow or other we'd like to just carry on our private little life in a private world, not have ourselves even know about it. Then I pointed out sex and sex dominion. Then I want to point out that fame is another one of the problems. And people are satisfied, and you must recognize this, in fame in small ways as well as great. People are often satisfied to be the president of the Ladies' Aid Society. Now, you and me might not even want such an office. We would think, what a ridiculous thing. Or they want to be the president of the Parent Teachers Association or a Boy Scout leader. They are people who probably recognize that they do not have the capacity to attain tremendous heights politically or in the entertainment world, the world of achievement in medicine or science, and they are limited. So they are satisfied with lesser aims. They want authority, they crave it, they crave attention. It is a manifestation also of the ego, and I would say that almost every single human problem is a derivative of the ego. The problem arises from the ego. Therefore, the question has then come up, and some of the great yogis and some of the great so-called masters, the pseudo-masters, will tell you, the thing for you to do is to rid yourselves of all the rajas and tamas, and they tell you that you have to get rid of all the expressions of the ego. You must kill the ego. And this is one of the most satanic lies that has ever been formulated in the world, because it is not a question of killing the ego or killing the self. If God didn't want individuality and egoistic expression, He would never have created man in the first place, because in the first place there was nothing but God and goodness. And when He created the ego already had the propensity, as soon as it became separate from Him, in a sense, right away it has a desire to express itself, and it sets up ideas that are contra to God. So He knew what He was doing when He created the ego. The only way that a man can achieve individual expression of God, in other words, be a separate part of God and still one with God, is by expressing through the individuality of himself. And the ego is individuality. Let's face it. So we are not dealing with a command from on high to kill our ego, but to redirect it. May I point that out to you? It is redirection of the ego from the lowest to the highest expression. And that is what it's all about. That is all of it, in a nutshell, is the redirection of the ego. The ego then, which I was talking about, redirected, sees itself as a divine expression and sets about the business of creating a pathway to attune with God consciously and willingly. And here is where the will comes in. If you don't have a will to be one with God, it will not happen. That is why religion is important, because religion, properly directed, is a course of instruction. And it helps to take you out of the woods. It is a compass. You can wander around forever in the human woods, in the three-dimensional state. Through re-embodiment, you could just keep on going and going and going, eating and drinking and sleeping and procreating and doing whatever things people do, and never, never, never attaining emancipation, and never attaining to the measurement of the stature of yourself. Well, the ego, of course, misused, is a cesspool, a bottomless pit. The ego properly used is the vehicle of your divine expression, because the ego becomes transcendent. The ego becomes one with God. That is exactly what Jesus meant when he said, I and my Father are one. And your recognition of the unity of yourself with God is a supreme means whereby you may motivate yourself to greater achievement. It is a transcendentalism that can vibrate in a cosmic circle so fast that it's almost impossible for you to realize it. And it can step up from a single solitary vibration per second to trillions and quadrillions of vibrations into almost infinite manifestations. In other words, your thought can be raised, it's almost like going, you know what I mean? You start out down in the lower ranges, and you can just sweep right up into divinity through the recognition of the fact that you and your Father are one. That statement by Jesus Christ was one of the most profound statements, when properly understood, that humanity has ever seen in their life or ever envisioned. To recognize that you must make a distinct recognition of yourself. After all, you were a byproduct of God. And as a byproduct of God, and I'm not referring to your level of manifestation, I'm talking about your original monadic design. You were made in the divine image. And being made in the divine image, there's no higher image you could be made in. You, through recognition of that image daily and paying recognition to God, are already creating the matrix of universal motivation. And that matrix of universal motivation is itself impelling to draw the light into your being. It fills your mind with light, it fills your body with light, it fills your whole being with light. And this is one of the essential factors that you must have. But you must recognize that you have the Christ now working through this idea. I and my Father are one. But you're living in a dual world. You still have the untransmuted substance of your world. In other words, please recognize, dear hearts, that you live in heaven and you live in Hades, all at the same time. Hades is a consciousness. It's a consciousness that the world is much involved in, without being involved in the other hemisphere of the heaven. When one finally achieves union with God, they are neither in heaven nor in Hades. They are out of it all. In other words, they step out of the universe of dualities into the universe of oneness. Then, of course, only good manifests. Then all of the principles that the Christian scientists talk about, that Unity School talks about, that people talk about, the nirvanic states and all these high states, it's all a manifestation of complete oneness with God and recognition of no other power but God. But so long as we are functioning in the level of the ego, we have these problems to contend with, because the ego is oriented the wrong way. Now, if you could have a panacea, a sweet little pill that you could swallow, and immediately Hades would fade away, and all of the things that you have ever done that are wrong would fade away, and you could just live in heaven. Heaven would soon elevate you to where you'd escape out of the duality of consciousness, you see. But it doesn't happen that way overnight, because there's a part of you yourself that is fighting against the light. I quote St. Paul now to show it to you. And so I find a law working in my members, that the good that I would do, that I do not, and the evil that I would not do, that do I. He referred to the law of dualities in the very function that I'm speaking about. Now, distress about this, of course, is quite natural, because people recognize their own impurity and impiety and their own weaknesses and their own lack of attainment, their shortcomings. But at the same time, as I have pointed out, no amount of human suffering over your weaknesses or lamentations is going to take you out of them and produce for you the miracle consciousness of Jesus Christ. There's only one thing that's going to produce the miracle consciousness of Jesus Christ, and that is the consciousness of Jesus Christ. And you have to develop it by living in it. I am absolutely convinced that I myself create my own barriers to divine union whenever they are created. That I myself open the door. And therefore, I myself must also open the door more fully to the light of the resurrection consciousness of Jesus Christ. I sent my soul, and I'm going to quote from Omar Khayyam, I sent my soul through the invisible to spell some word of the hereafter, and by my soul returned to me and said, I myself am heaven and hell. So recognizing that the qualities of these are in you, both of them, and that they are still dual, because they are dealing with the same equation as the fruit of good and evil. The tree of life is contra to that, and it is supreme. You then, in order to have the healing of the leaves of the tree of life, have to learn to cast aside the dual consciousness of good and evil brought out in the parable of Adam and Eve in the garden, where he said, the day thou eatest of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that day thou shalt die. This means that the consciousness that was once in the garden able to directly apprehend the Father and the unity of the Father's expression no longer lived in man. He was cut off from God and awareness by the knowledge of the tree that was dual, good and evil. Good and evil cannot exist in the consciousness of God. Therefore, we understand the nature of the deity a great deal more when we realize that the duality is only made in the fashion of a man. And I give you then the mark of the beast, 666, which in Revelation it says is the number of a man. The bestial nature of man is totally involved with the 666, just as the number of man's freedom is 333, which is the power of the 3 times 3 times 3. It's the functioning of the divine. And it opens up the eightfold path of righteousness. You know why? Because you take the threes, take 33, and put the 33 together, and what have you got? You've got a hinge. I am the door. See, it's a hinge on the door. And when the hinge is put together, the threes, you have the figure 8. And the upper figure in the 8 is right here, it's your presence, and the lower figure's down here, and Christ is the mediator at the nexus of the 8. So you have to recognize all of this. You have to recognize it, and you have to cease berating yourself or the deity. You can neither blame yourself, nor can you blame God. You are a part of a manifestation that is not yet born. You are in the birth process, and the travail you sense at times, together with its ecstasy, is all a part of the birth process, because birth does involve travail and does involve ecstasy. It's like the agony and the ecstasy. We experience from day to day an agony in this birth process, and we experience from day to day the ecstasy of the birth process. The ecstasy is all around us. It's a tremendous thing. But we've got to be careful that in these dualities we don't get hung up on ecstasy or hung up on agony. People who are hung up on agony are often pessimistic, and they love to tell their troubles to the world. People hung up on ecstasy are often visionary to the point where they have no practicality. They do not recognize the facts of life that will lead them out of this world into the world of God. I have given you today a little talk on yourself. It involves the greatness that is in you and the mediocrity. The mediocrity is the mediocrity of the world. The greatness is the greatness of God. No man can love the mediocrity of the world and still love the Father. The love of the Father is not in us if we love the mediocrity of the world. Yet we must learn to use the world without abusing it. All things were given to us naturally, to use within a framework of pure reason. And reason simply is re-sun, R-E-S-U-N. It's the reuse of the sun of illumination. It's the use of a thing. Evil, in other words, ani soit qui mal y pense. Evil be to him who evil sees. If we see our life as evil, it will become so. If we see our life as good, it will become so. As we think in our heart, so we are. So let us then recognize this and no longer be a victim of our mental states. When mental states come, recognize the tempter uses many forms. We are not concerned with the tempter. We are concerned with God and God liberation. Divine liberation will come to you through this activity. And how long it takes will depend on you. As far as God's concerned, He'd make it today, this minute. As far as you're concerned, you probably will agree with the same idea. But agreeing with it and actually putting it into practice is another question, because we always deal with momentums. Remember Father Flanagan, little design he had? He says, he's not heavy, Father, he's my brother. Well, you know, your burdens are not heavy either. But maybe you can't lift them. And that's why we need the masters. That's why we need instruction. That's why we need admonishment. That's why we need each other. We are here in a great cosmic help-meet program. We are help-meets for one another. And that's above and beyond all sex and all activities of the flesh. It's the helping lift the burden of the world. And when we do, we lift our own. So I hope you've learned something from what we pointed out now. God bless you. This morning we would treat of the absolute, of the perfection of God, by which He formulated the outer manifestations in their exquisite beauty and organization. The absolute, then, is the progenitor of all life. And having such a Father, how can we expect the byproduct of the Son to differ from the Father? It does not. For when the entire diorama of the cosmos is all complete, you see, and harmoniously working and uninterfered with, by human consciousness or any other consciousness except the consciousness of the Absolute, you see all of the component parts blend into one manifestation of harmonious perfection. This we call the body of God. We are intended as the Christ and as the bride of the Christ, the church, to become one with that body of God on earth. But we are not limited to the extent of the earth as this planetary orb is known. Nor are we limited to the outer physical envelope of cosmos insofar as the spiral nebulae of which we are a part is known. Nor are we limited by all of cosmos with its myriad twinkling lights into vast infinite distances. If the cosmos is infinite, which we postulate, then we must understand that this infinity manifest in the finite form of cosmos is greater than itself and passes beyond the realm of the physical manifestation into the realm of pure spirit, where we allow that infinity manifests, because spirit is infinite. So in treating of the Absolute, we are going to take particular and specific note that the lives of men are usually not harmonious with this Absolute. And so the duality manifests in our outer consciousness, and it of necessity promotes a spirit of separation. Man feels that he dwells in a separate field from the cosmos. This finite field of self becomes a field of self-limitation. But the question before us, is this the correct attitude? Should we consider ourselves a limited mortal person? Should we continually stress our faults, our failures, to measure up to the completeness of the Absolute? We ask ourselves this question. And the answer cannot be derived from academics. The answer cannot even be derived from existentialism, from experience, or the realm of effects. The answer can only be derived from the realm of cause, and there we go back to the Absolute. So from the Absolute we realize with St. Paul that we live and move and have our being in Him. As certain also of your poets have also said, we are His offspring. We postulate then that the physical vehicle and even the mental vehicle and even the emotional vehicle are not primary offsprings of God, but rather, if you will, the chip of the soul, the little chip of wood cut from the parent tree, this chip of the soul, this infinite bark is our reality. With this Jesus was concerned. He said, "What shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and shall lose his own soul," thus producing the thought in Christian literature, by his speech, by his word, that the soul could be lost. We ask ourselves then, why can the soul be lost? Why should it be lost? If the soul is the real person, how can the real person be lost? viewed from the divine aspect, it cannot be lost, because it belonged first to God, and it is God, and therefore it returns to God regardless of what function we may make of it. So it is not then lost to the cosmos. It is not lost to God at all. It is lost to us. It ceases to become a vehicle for self-expression. In other words, we lose our opportunity. The soul was the matrix of God that was given to us in order to help us to produce a personality made in the image of the matrix. And what is the purpose of this temporal personality that we are making in the matrix, supposedly, of the soul? It is a temporary vehicle in which we are temporarily seated until our various faculties by cosmic merit are themselves anchored in the soul and merged with it. The whole drama of the cosmos is one in which we live and move and have our being so that we can become the soul. But we cannot, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. There must come about and be produced the miracle of change. Change only because we are dealing with mutability now. First, the absolute comes before us, and this is immutable. We deal with immutability, and we deal with mutability. This is a duality. What then is the purpose of life? It is so that that which is mutable can be changed into that which is immutable. And we find it beautifully put by St. Paul, where he says one star differs from another star in glory. Also where he says, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, for the last trump shall sound, and the dead shall be raised. He then turns this manifestation in which we cast our entire being, this physical manifestation, this I, this me, this mind, this possessive sense, all of this as dead. Why? Because there can be no possibility of flesh and blood inheriting spirit. But there is a possibility of having a change, of the mutation taking place in ourselves that will enable this change, this wondrous change, to produce by the alchemical power of making full use of opportunity the self from a being finite to a being infinite. In other words, that which is so non-absolute becomes absolute. He mentions a moment in the twinkling of an eye, when the last trump shall sound. And I consider it somewhat of a game, because we are dealing now with human foibles in which we make ourselves in this grand chess game of life pawns to various forces. But it is only when we become pawns to the divine that we can very gladly lose ourselves or be spent, as St. Paul puts it, spent. We can be spent for God, for Christ, for reality. This reality then becomes that to which we give our all. In reality, of course, everyone says, we want a choice, we want free will. This means everything to us. Dear hearts, surely we have free will. But in one way we have no free will. And I will cite it to you and prove it to you in a very beautiful homily. Jesus is sitting there with the disciples. To whom shall we go, Lord?
for thou hast the words of eternal life. To whom shall we go? What choice do we really have in reality? When this blazing, dazzling splendor of the universe, of the cosmos, of the absolute, that brings forth the green shoot and the renewal of life on the tree, that manifests in this diadem of myriad stars shining in the sky, that is the power to cognize in the mind, is the reach of the mind, is the wondrous control of the emotional body, so that sheer joy can be experienced because it is controlled. Do you see? Joy cannot be experienced when it is rushing as mad passion to some sordid fulfillment, but only where it is governed. Somewhere it says, and I will leap as a young hart, H-A-R-T. This is a controlled leap. It is not an uncontrolled contortion, a twist in space. It is a function, a beautiful function of divine symmetry in action, do you see? We are dealing with the Spirit, with the kingdom of God, with heaven. And the world is reaching for the culture of heaven in all of their reach, but they never touch it even, because it is always surrounded by the bedazzlement of the ego. It is a continual case of one star wanting to differ from another star in glory so that it will be thought more dazzling, more brilliant. And none of this will produce anything for us except more of the same unfortunate facets of history that have occurred down through the years, which we know full well, for we see all of the same patterns repeating themselves today. And in people, I do not actually see any difference today in the people that are in the contemporary scene than in ancient Rome, or going back into ancient Babylon, or Ur of the Chaldees. The same vanities plague and perplex us all, the same fruitless sense of continuity that we know full well is not real, plagues us. People seem to think that they're going to live forever in their present environment and stature. Yet they have witnessed the miracle or debacle of change occur in their own world all the way from the cradle on, and will till the grave comes. They will see this. Yet they talk about constancy, the constancy of the ego. I say to you today that the ego is inconstant. It has no faith at all, except it be wedded to the absolute, to God. It has no reality. It has nothing. It is a constant case of change for change's sake. Change the vibrations, change the pattern, change the environment. But always the same ego, always the same ideas, the same confusions beset us, the same struggle for recognition, when there should be no struggle for recognition, because we should, like a flower, open. And when a flower opens, this is no struggle at all. It is a natural unfoldment. And this is what man should and ought to do. He should unfold into his divinity. He should just expand and reach out for God. It's such a pure thing, such a very marvelous gift. It is a natural manifestation all the way. Yet we insist on the synthetic, and we bring about our own obsolescence. And we plan it that way, even for ourselves as people. But God wants none of it, because He does not wish His children to eat tripe. The trivial, the mediocre,